There are moments when a single, quiet deviation in an otherwise predictable routine doesn't just interrupt your day, it fundamentally alters the landscape of everything you thought you understood about your surroundings. If you spend enough years looking at the exact same physical arrangements, measuring distances down to the millimeter, and cataloging objects with absolute precision, you learn that reality rarely stutters without a reason. The world operates on predictable physical laws. When a piece of that world shifts without a sound, without a trace, and without an obvious hand behind it, your initial reaction isn't fear, it is a quiet, burning insistence to understand how the equation broke. My name is Julian. For the past 9 years, I have worked as a senior archivist and paper conservator at a privately funded historical repository nestled in a quiet, undisturbed district. My job is defined by order, patience, and meticulous observation. Every document, ledger, cartographic map, and bound manuscript that enters our climate-controlled vaults must be logged, examined under specialized light, assessed for degradation, and assigned a strict location code. I know the weight of the rag paper used in the late 18th century versus the wood pulp paper of the mid-19th century simply by feeling the texture between my thumb and index finger. I know the exact humidity levels required to keep vellum from warping, and I know the precise layout of every shelf across all 4 floor levels of our facility. My life outside the archives is equally structured. I live alone in a modest apartment 4 blocks away, walk the same tree-lined route every morning at 7:15, purchase a black coffee from the same corner vendor, and arrive at the conservation lab precisely 20 minutes before the main doors unlock. I do not enjoy surprises. In my profession, a surprise usually means mold bloom, ink gall corrosion, or a failure in the HVAC filtration system. I prefer certainty, verifiable facts, and quiet, systematic progress. The building itself is a substantial, 3-story stone structure erected in the late Victorian era, supplemented by a deep, reinforced subterranean vault level built decades later during a structural modernization. It features thick masonry walls, original brass hardware, hardwood cabinetry in the upper reading rooms, and heavy, fireproof steel doors securing the lower storage areas. Because our collection focuses on regional property records, industrial blueprints, and private institutional correspondence spanning 2 centuries, we rarely receive walk-in public visitors. Most of our work involves digitizing rare holdings for academic institutions or performing painstaking chemical stabilization on decaying manuscripts. On a Tuesday morning in mid-October, the environment was entirely normal. The weather outside was overcast, bringing a cool, steady rain that drummed softly against the high, narrow windows of the second-floor conservation laboratory. The internal temperature was locked at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, with relative humidity holding steady at 45%. I had spent the first 2 hours of my shift under the shadowless lamps of my workbench, using a camel hair brush and a mild dry-cleaning sponge to remove surface soot from a series of late 19th century land survey maps. At roughly 10:15, I stepped away from the bench to return a metal casing containing 3 restored topographical rolls to vault sublevel 2. This sublevel is the most secure and environmental stable section of the entire building. Access is restricted to primary staff members, requiring a physical keyway turn followed by a 6-digit security code entered into an electronic keypad beside the heavy steel access door. The sublevel consists of a long, central concrete corridor illuminated by motion-activated LED tube lights overhead. Branching off this corridor are 6 identical storage bays, designated Bay A through Bay F. Each bay is fitted with floor-to-ceiling mobile high-density shelving units, massive steel stacks that glide smoothly along recessed floor tracks via mechanical hand cranks. I entered Bay C, which houses civic infrastructure blueprints and regional public works records from the 1880s through the 1920s. The air inside the bay always carries a distinct, sharp aroma, a mixture of microcrystalline wax, aged linen paper, iron gall ink, and the dry, metallic tang of the powder-coated steel shelves. The motion sensor clicked overhead, casting a bright, neutral white light across the aisle. I walked to aisles 4, turned the mechanical crank on the face of the outer shelf frame, and watched the heavy steel base slide apart with a low, smooth hum, creating a 3-foot-wide walking path between the rows of archival boxes. I knew precisely what should be on shelf 3, section B of that aisle. For the past 3 weeks, I had been personally recataloguing the contents of box C412 through box C430. I had cleared shelf 3 the previous afternoon at 4:30, placing 5 restored gray acid-free document boxes in numerical sequence: C415, C416, C417, C418, and C419. I had noted their placement in the digital ledger, locked the bay, and departed for the evening. When the aisle opened fully, I stepped inside and stopped. Shelf 3 was not empty, nor was it arranged as I had left it. Sitting squarely in the center of the dark gray steel surface, directly between box C416 and box C417, was a small, heavy object that did not belong in base C. In fact, it did not belong in any part of our cataloging system. It was a compact, rectangular wooden box, roughly 6 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches deep. The wood was dense, dark, and smooth, exhibiting the deep reddish-brown patina of polished walnut or mahogany. It lacked any brass fittings, hinges, or visible keyholes. The corners were joined with exquisite, hand-cut dovetail joints so precise that the seam lines looked almost drawn on with a fine pencil. There was no dust on its top surface. I stood completely still in the narrow aisle, the metal casing of topographical rolls still resting under my arm. My first thought was not one of intrigue, but of immediate professional annoyance. Someone on the team had clearly broken protocol. A staff member had brought an uncatalogued artifact into the sublevel, set it down while retrieving another box, and forgotten to retrieve it. It was a sloppy, careless breach of vault management rules. I set my topographical casing down on the work trolley at the end of the aisle, retrieved a pair of clean white cotton inspection gloves from my apron pocket, and pulled them on. I stepped back into the aisle and leaned down to examine the object without touching it. The wooden box rested flat on the steel shelf. There were no adhesive labels, no barcode inventory tags, and no painted call numbers anywhere on its exposed sides. Upon closer inspection under the direct overhead light, I noticed that the top lid was entirely flush with the side walls, featuring a subtle, inlaid brass geometric symbol in the exact center, a simple circle intersected by 3 parallel vertical lines. The brass was clean, unoxidized, and flush with the wood grain. I picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, weighing perhaps 2 or 3 pounds. The weight felt solid, centered, and completely motionless. There was no shift of internal liquid, no rattle of loose components, and no mechanical ticking. The bottom surface was as smooth as the sides, completely featureless. I tried to slide the lid gently with my gloved thumbs. It did not budge. There was no lip to catch a fingernail, no visible latch to depress, and no sliding seam around the perimeter. It appeared, for all practical purposes, to be a solid block of joinery, yet the subtle variation in wood grain between the lid and the base proved it was indeed an enclosed container. I carried the box out of Bay C, stepped into the central corridor, and brought it straight to the main conservation lab on the 2nd floor. The lab is a large, brightly lit workspace equipped with stainless steel sinks, fume hoods, suction tables, high-magnification stereo microscopes, and wall-to-wall oak storage cabinets. My colleague, Arthur, was standing by the central island, carefully applying wheat starch paste to a torn map border with a fine sable brush. Arthur is 15 years my senior, a man of quiet habits with thin gray hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, and an encyclopedic knowledge of regional paper manufacturing histories. He has worked at the facility for over 20 years and prides himself on knowing every inch of the collection. I placed the wooden box onto a clean sheet of blotting paper in the middle of the island. "Arthur," I said, keeping my voice calm and neutral. "Who was working down in sublevel 2 this morning before my shift?" Arthur paused, holding his brush suspended an inch above the map. He looked over his spectacles at the wooden box, then up at me. "No one," he replied, his tone dry and matter-of-fact. "I opened the main perimeter security at 7:30. You arrived at 7:40. Clara isn't scheduled to come in until noon today, and Marcus is at the regional conference until Thursday." "Why? What is that?" "I found it in Base C," I said, pointing a gloved finger at the object. "Tucked right between box C416 and C417. It isn't catalogued. There's no accession tag, no temporary slip, and it wasn't there when I locked the aisle at 4:30 yesterday afternoon." Arthur set his brush down in a glass rest, wiped his fingers on a towel, and walked around the table. He leaned over the box, examining the inlaid brass symbol on the lid without touching the wood. "Base C? Arthur asked, frowning slightly. That's Regional Public Works and Survey records. We haven't taken in a new three-dimensional artifact collection in over 6 months, and anything of that nature gets processed in the basement staging room first, not left on an active research shelf. I know, I said. That's why I assumed you or Clara might have brought it down temporarily. Arthur reached out, picked up the box with his bare hands, turned it over, and tried the lid with his thumb just as I had done. It's tight. Very tight tolerance. Look at these joints. This isn't modern commercial work. This is mid to late 19th century cabinetry. Look at the oxidation on the brass inlay, or rather, the lack of it. It's been kept in an airtight environment or handled very frequently until recently. How did it get into sublevel 2, Arthur? I asked, focusing entirely on the logistical reality. The vault access logs are digital. If someone went down there after we left yesterday, the system recorded the keycard turn. Then go check the terminal, Arthur said reasonably, setting the box back down on the blotting paper. It's obviously a simple mix-up. Clara probably dropped it off late yesterday afternoon before leaving, or the director had a private donor bring something in for evaluation and forgot to leave a staging docket. You know how disorganized the director can be when a new acquisition arrives. Arthur's explanation was entirely logical. The director, a gentleman named Howard who spent most of his time fundraising and dealing with the board of trustees, was notorious for carrying items into the building without immediately completing the intake paperwork. It was a constant source of friction between his office and the conservation team. I walked down the hallway to the administration office, sat at the security console, and logged into the access control software. The software records every single electronic entry event across the building's exterior doors, floor gates, and vault entrances. I filtered the log for vault sublevel 2, setting the time window from yesterday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I had finished my work in Bay C to 7:40 this morning when I had unlocked the lab. I scrolled through the entries. At 16:32 yesterday, Julian, keycard number 042, sublevel 2 entrance, access granted. At 16:34 yesterday, Julian, keycard number 042, sublevel 2 exit, door secured. At 17:15 yesterday, main building perimeter security, arm system, Arthur. There were no entries overnight. There were no motion sensor trips recorded on the internal security panel between 17:15 yesterday and 7:30 this morning. The first entry of the day was Arthur at 7:30, followed by my own entry through the front gate at 7:40, and my sublevel access at 10:14. I stared at the glowing blue monitor for several long moments. The system was robust. The door to sublevel 2 is a solid steel security barrier with a heavy magnetic latch and a deadbolt. There are no windows in the sublevel. There are no ventilation ducts larger than 6 inches in diameter, far too small for a human being to access, even if the security mesh inside the ductwork hadn't been intact. I printed the log sheet, folded it neatly, and walked back to the conservation lab. Arthur was sitting at his microscope, adjusting the focus on a thread sample. Well, he asked without looking up. The vault wasn't open after I left yesterday, I said, placing the printed paper on his desk. No keycard turns. No motion alarms. No entry by Howard, Clara, or anyone else. Arthur stopped turning the fine focus knob. He turned his chair around and looked at the printout, his brows furrowed in mild confusion. The motion sensors in the sublevel are tied to the main panel, Julian. If an overhead light clicked on or a door opened, it would be on that sheet. I know, I said. Yet the box was sitting on shelf 3 of Bay C, positioned neatly between 2 document cases that I personally aligned yesterday afternoon. Arthur stood up, walked back to the island, and picked up the wooden box again. He held it up to the overhead fluorescent light, turning it slowly. Sensors fail. Software glitches happen. You know as well as I do that the building's wiring on the lower levels has been temperamental since the storm last month. The log probably missed a keycard scan when Howard went down to stash something. Keycards are hard-coded electrical circuits, Arthur, I replied quietly. The magnetic strike plate physically cannot disengage without recording the circuit interrupt on the central board. Even if the software failed to log the name, it would record an unhandled access event. There are 0 events. Arthur sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose beneath his glasses. Julian, let's not turn a mundane clerical error into a ghost story. The box is physical. It is made of mahogany, brass, and wood glue. It did not materialize out of thin air. Someone placed it there. The most reasonable explanation is that it was placed there weeks ago during the quarterly audit, tucked behind box C416, and when you shifted those cases yesterday, you uncovered it without realizing it. I listened to his reasoning. His explanation was logical, grounded, and anchored entirely in mundane reality. It assumed human oversight rather than impossible events. I wanted to accept it. It made professional sense. If that's true, I said, then where's its catalog number? Every single item from the quarterly audit was given a high visibility yellow tracking sticker on the base. Arthur turned the box upside down. The dark wood on the bottom was completely clean, smooth, and unblemished. There was no sticker, no trace of adhesive residue, and no scraped surface where a label might have been removed. He rubbed his chin, staring at the clean wood. All right, he conceded quietly. That is slightly odd. I'm going to examine it under the ultraviolet lamp, I said. I carried the box into the dark room at the back of the lab, a small, windowless space used for multispectral imaging and photographic preservation. I placed the box on the black felt mat under the overhead ultraviolet fixture and flipped the switch. The room flooded with a deep, purple glow. Under ultraviolet light, invisible organic residues, modern adhesives, finger oils, and faint chemical traces often fluoresce brightly. If someone had handled the box recently with bare hands, or if an old paper label had been scrubbed off with a solvent, the light would reveal the outline immediately. I leaned over the table, adjusting my yellow protective glasses. The wood grain fluoresced faintly with a natural, dull amber tone typical of aged natural shellac. There were no finger smudges. There were no chemical streaks indicating a scrub label. However, as I brought my eyes closer to the top lid, the ultraviolet light revealed something that was completely invisible under standard white illumination. Traced across the smooth wooden surface of the lid, surrounding the inlaid brass symbol, were several faint lines of written script. They were not carved into the wood, they appeared to have been written with an organic, iron-based or botanical ink that had absorbed into the finish without altering its color under visible light. The script was small, precise, and written in a sharp, disciplined cursive hand. I pulled a high magnification macro lens camera over the table, focused the lens on the top surface, and took 3 high-resolution capture photographs under the UV bulb. Then I transferred the raw image files to the desktop monitor beside the bench and applied a high-contrast monochromatic filter to bring out the faint lines. The text became clearly legible against the dark background of the wood. It was not an ancient language. It was English, written in a formal, mid-19th century style. There were 4 short lines centered above the brass symbol. The ledger remains incomplete where the stone was laid. Look to the foundation before the 3rd ledger closes. 42 paces from the western pier. Do not disturb the dry joinery. I read the 4 lines twice. The phrasing was cryptic, yet entirely specific. It referenced physical structures, a foundation, a western pier, dry joinery, and used terminology familiar to civil engineering and masonry. Arthur walked into the darkroom, leaning over my shoulder to look at the monitor screen. He stared at the crisp white text floating on the dark background. Well, Arthur said softly, his voice losing its dismissive edge for the first time. That certainly wasn't written this morning. No, I agreed, tracing the digital outline of the words with the cursor. The ink absorption pattern matches the aging of the shellac finish. Whoever wrote this wrote it before the top varnish fully hardened. This writing has been on this box for at least a century. A western pier, Arthur muttered, reading the 3rd line aloud. The old bridge records in Bay C? Is that what it's referring to? Bay C holds the regional bridge construction files from 1890, I noted. Specifically the records for the old river crossing that was demolished 60 years ago. So someone stored an uncatalogued artifact relating to the bridge archive, Arthur said, leaning back and crossing his arms. It's an old surveyor's box or a cornerstone deposit box. Someone found it years ago in the lower vaults, set it on a shelf, and forgot about it. The writing was invisible, so nobody realized what it was. His explanation was logical, grounded, and anchored entirely in mundane reality. It explained the age of the item, the content of the text, and its presence in the building. Yet it still failed to explain one fundamental detail. I picked up the physical log sheet I had printed from the security system and held it up beside the monitor. "Arthur," I said quietly. "Even if this box has been in the building for 100 years. I cleared shelf 3 of Bay C at 4:30 yesterday afternoon. I wiped down the steel surface with a microfiber cloth. I placed boxes C415 through C419 in a direct, continuous line. There was no space between C416 and C417. This box was not on that shelf 17 hours ago." Arthur looked at the printed security log, then at the image of the writing on the monitor, and finally at the small mahogany box resting silently on the felt mat. "Then how did it get there, Julian?" he asked quietly. I looked down at the dark wooden box. Under the plain white lights of the lab, the script vanished completely once more, leaving only the polished, unblemished wood and the flush brass circle with its 3 vertical lines. "I don't know," I replied. "But whoever or whatever put it there didn't break the lock on the door. And they didn't leave a single footprint." I looked closer at the brass symbol on the lid. For the first time, I noticed that the 3 parallel vertical lines inside the circle were not equal in length. The outer 2 lines were slightly shorter than the middle one, precisely mimicking the layout of the structural support columns that ran through the deep basement level of our own building. If the box had not been brought in from the outside, and if no one had entered from the doors above, where had it actually come from? An anomaly in an archive is not a mystery to be marveled at, it is a clerical failure that demands immediate correction. When a physical object appears in a secured, climate-controlled vault without a digital paper trail, a chain of custody, or an accession record, the absolute worst thing a professional can do is indulge in dramatic speculation. The physical universe operates on strict conservation of mass and momentum. Objects do not manifest through solid steel or concrete. They are moved by human hands, carried through doorways, and misplaced by human error. If a security log shows no entries, the most logical assumption is not that the laws of physics have collapsed, but that the logging mechanism itself suffered a technical fault, or that an overlooked access point exists within the architecture of the building. My initial response on Wednesday morning was entirely pragmatic. I did not spend the early hours pondering the cryptic text revealed under the ultraviolet lamp. Words written on what 100 years ago are merely historical artifacts until proven otherwise. They carry no inherent authority over a modern facility. My immediate priority was to systematically test every possible physical and technical explanation for how the dark mahogany box could have been placed on shelf 3 of Bay C without triggering an electronic record. I began at 7:45 by filing a formal maintenance request with our facilities operations manager, an old-school site technician named Miller who had maintained the building's mechanical and electrical systems for nearly 30 years. Miller was a taciturn, pragmatic man who viewed the entire building not as an antique structure, but as a complex network of plumbing, wiring, air ducts, and load-bearing masonry. I requested that Miller perform a comprehensive diagnostic on the electronic lock assembly and motion sensors of vault sublevel 2. While Miller set up his testing equipment in the basement corridor, I went to the administrative office on the ground floor to review the original architectural blueprints of the facility. Our building had undergone 3 major structural phases. The original 3-story stone edifice was constructed in 1888 for a regional railway and land development corporation. In 1934, after the corporation dissolved, the building was purchased by a private educational trust, which added the reinforced subterranean vault level, now known as Sublevel 1, to store historical records. Finally, in 1972, a secondary, deeper subterranean level, Sublevel 2, was excavated directly beneath the first vault to house microfilm survey documents and sensitive regional blueprints under strict environmental controls. I spread the large, yellowed vellum sheets of the 1972 construction plans across the grand oak table in the central reading room. The plans were meticulous. They detailed 2-foot-thick poured concrete walls reinforced with steel rebar, lining the entirety of Sublevel 2. The ceiling of Sublevel 2 was composed of 3 feet of solid concrete, separating it from Sublevel 1 above. The floor was a slab resting directly on bedrock. I traced the ventilation shafts with my finger. The environmental air supply for sublevel 2 was pulled down from the rooftop HVAC unit through a central vertical duct. At the sublevel entry point, the main duct split into 4 smaller branches, each measuring 8 inches by 6 inches, protected by internal steel security grills designed to prevent unauthorized entry or pest infestation. A rectangular box measuring 6 inches by 4 inches could not physically pass through the 6-inch vertical clearance of the duct, even assuming someone had managed to drop it down from 3 stories above through a heavy-duty air filtration unit. There were no secondary doors. There were no emergency escape hatches. There were no legacy elevator shafts or disused dumbwaiters extending into sublevel 2. According to the official construction records, sublevel 2 was an isolated concrete cube with exactly one point of egress, the heavy steel security door equipped with a magnetic lock and digital keypad. By 10 o'clock, Miller completed his diagnostic testing on the sublevel 2 access door. He walked up to the conservation lab carrying a heavy yellow tool case and a digital diagnostic readout terminal. I was at my workbench, carefully measuring the exact exterior dimensions of the mahogany box with a set of digital calipers. Miller set his terminal on the edge of the stainless steel counter. "The lock assembly is clean, Julian," he said in his raspy, gravelly voice. I ran a full-loop test on the magnetic strike plate and the optical motion sensors. The circuit is solid. Voltage is stable at 12 volts DC. No drops, no ground faults, no short circuits. Is it possible for the system to disengage without logging an event? I asked, looking up from my calipers. Could a momentary drop in main power allow the door to swing open while the software remains frozen? Miller shook his head firmly. Not this board. It's a fail-secure latch. If the power cuts out completely, the magnetic plate stays deadlocked by a heavy mechanical spring. The only way that latch retracts is if the solenoid receives an explicit signal from the keypad or the internal override button. And if either of those triggers happens, the onboard memory chip writes the timestamp to a local buffer before it even sends the signal to the door. Even if the network cable was cut, the buffer holds the event until the system reconnects. I pulled the buffer chip directly. There are no missing event codes. The door was not opened between 4:30 yesterday afternoon and 7:30 this morning. I pointed toward the overhead ceiling ducts. What about the environmental supply lines? Is there any point where a mechanical failure in the ductwork could allow something to drop into Bay C? Miller let out a short, dry laugh. Julian, those ducts are 8 inches wide and packed with high-efficiency particulate air filters, damper plates, and steel security bars every 6 feet. A mouse couldn't get down those pipes without getting shredded by the blower fan or stuck in a grate. Whatever put that piece of wood on your shelf didn't come through the air system. Then we are left with an impossibility, Miller, I said calmly. The box was not on that shelf when I departed yesterday. It was there when I returned this morning. Physical objects do not navigate concrete walls independently. Then someone's lying to you, or someone has a physical key to the manual override box on the outer wall, Miller replied simply, picking up his tool case. The override box bypasses the digital board entirely using a mechanical tubular key. If someone used a physical key on the emergency release, it wouldn't show up in the software log. I paused, absorbing this new piece of information. Who has access to the manual override keys? There are only 3 keys in existence, Miller stated, ticking them off on his thick fingers. One is locked in the master key safe in the director's office. One is in my emergency belt pouch right here. He tapped a heavy leather pouch clipped to his waist. And the third is held off-site in the central security deposit box at the regional bank. Miller's explanation offered a logical, realistic pathway. A physical key bypass would account for every single anomaly. It would allow someone to open the heavy steel door manually without triggering an electrical event in the software log, leaving no digital footprint whatsoever. I immediately walked up to the 3rd floor to speak with Howard, the facility director. Howard's office was a spacious, wood-paneled room filled with antique leather armchairs, stacks of donor brochures, and framed historical maps of the state. Howard himself was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp tweed suit. He was an administrator by trade, far more interested in board meetings and endowment grants than the tedious day-to-day realities of manuscript conservation. When I entered, Howard was sitting at his large mahogany desk, reviewing a financial audit document. I sat down opposite him and laid out the situation plainly, omitting any mention of the ultraviolet text to keep the focus entirely on the security breach. "Howard," I began, "we have an uncatalogued artifact sitting in the conservation lab that was deposited into Vault Sublevel 2 overnight without an entry in the digital access logs. Miller informed me that a manual override key exists in your office safe. I need to verify if the key has been accessed." Howard blinked in surprise, setting his gold-rimmed pen down on the desk. "A breach in Sublevel 2? Julian, that's highly unlikely. No one has touched the emergency override keys since the annual fire inspection 6 months ago. We need to check the safe, Howard," I insisted quietly. "It is the only logical explanation for how the vault door could be bypassed without a software entry." Howard sighed, stood up, and walked over to the corner of his office where a heavy, fireproof iron safe sat against the wall. He spun the mechanical combination dial, pulled the heavy door open, and reached into a small internal wooden drawer. He withdrew a small, velvet-lined metal box, opened the latch, and held it out toward me. Inside rested a single, bright brass tubular key marked with the serial code MK03. Beside it lay a small paper log slip. The last entry on the log slip was dated April 12th of the current year, signed in clear blue ink by Miller and Howard during the mandatory system testing. "The key hasn't been moved, Julian," Howard said, closing the velvet box. "And the combination to this safe is known only to myself and the board chairman, who is currently in Europe. Is it possible an unauthorized duplicate was manufactured?" I asked. "Tubular security keys of that grade require a specialized milling machine and an authorized corporate clearance code to duplicate," Howard replied, returning the velvet box to the safe and swinging the heavy door shut. "It is virtually impossible for someone to duplicate the key without leaving a commercial paper trail at the manufacturer." I sat in the armchair, evaluating the facts. The digital software log showed 0 entries. The physical emergency override key was secured in the director's safe. The second key was clipped to Miller's belt. The third key was sealed in a bank vault 4 miles away. The ventilation ducts were physically impassable. The concrete walls were intact. Every standard, logical explanation for how a physical object could enter Sublevel 2 was systematically unraveling under close scrutiny. Yet, the physical reality of the mahogany box remained undeniable. It was currently sitting on blotting paper in the second-floor laboratory, occupying 3-dimensional space. I returned to the laboratory. Arthur was standing near the window, holding a magnifying glass over the mahogany box, examining the fine seams of the dovetailed joinery under natural daylight. "Did you find your rogue key holder?" Arthur asked without looking up. "The key in the director's safe is present and accounted for," I replied, sitting down at my desk. "Miller's key is on his belt." The digital lock showed no voltage drops or bypass circuits. Logically, the box could not have entered Sublevel 2 through the main doorway. Arthur set his magnifying glass down and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, Julian, if a door wasn't used, and an air duct wasn't used, then we must re-examine our initial assumptions about where the box actually was before you found it." "What do you mean?" "You said you cleared Shelf 3 of Bay C yesterday afternoon," Arthur noted gently. "You placed boxes C415 through C419 on the steel rack. Is it possible, just barely possible, that the box was already resting inside one of those larger document cases? Perhaps inside box C416 or C417? And when you moved the cases, or when the shelf vibrated during the night, it slipped out?" I stared at Arthur. His hypothesis was another attempt to find a grounded, rational explanation, but it immediately fell apart upon structural analysis. Box C416 and C417 are standard, heavy-duty acid-free archival storage boxes, I explained patiently, pulling a blank box from a nearby shelf to demonstrate. They measure 15 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 10 inches deep. They are constructed of thick corrugated paperboard with tight-fitting lids. A solid mahogany box measuring 6 inches by 4 inches and weighing nearly 3 pounds could not slip out of a closed, lidded paperboard box and neatly position itself flat on a shelf between two cases without knocking the cases over, dislodging the lids, or leaving visible structural damage on the paperboard. Arthur nodded reluctantly. Fair enough. That was a reach. Furthermore, I continued, I personally opened box C416 and C417 yesterday to inspect the land survey maps inside. I handled every document within them. The wooden box was not inside those cases. Then we are missing a detail, Arthur said firmly. We are simply failing to observe something obvious. A piece of the puzzle is right in front of us, and we are misinterpreting it because we are focusing on the mystery rather than the physical mechanics. Arthur's statement was profoundly true. In science and conservation, when a phenomenon appears impossible, it is never because the laws of nature have been suspended, it is always because the observer has accepted an incorrect premise. I decided to re-examine my premises from the ground up. Premise 1, the box was placed on shelf 3 of base C between 1634 yesterday and 1014 today. Premise 2, sublevel 2 was an entirely sealed concrete environment with only one entrance. Premise 3, the single entrance was not open during the time frame in question. If premises 2 and 3 were verifiably true, proven by structural blueprints and uncompromised electrical diagnostics, then premise 1 had to be flawed. Either the box was not placed on the shelf during that time frame, or my understanding of sublevel 2's physical boundaries was incomplete. I picked up the mahogany box, carried it over to the lab's analytical table, and decided to perform a non-invasive physical examination of its material properties. If the box had been resting in an unknown physical environment prior to its appearance, it might carry microscopic trace evidence, dust, pollen, chemical residue, or atmospheric particulates that could identify its previous location. I placed the box under our high-resolution digital stereo microscope, which was connected to a large color monitor. I adjusted the halogen ring light to illuminate the corners of the dovetail joints at 50 times magnification. The screen filled with the magnified texture of the mahogany wood fibers. The finish was smooth, but within the microscopic crevices of the joint seams, small specks of trapped dust and particulate matter were clearly visible. I used a fine, sterile tungsten needle to collect 3 tiny particulate samples from the seam crevices, placing them carefully onto a glass microscope slide. I added a drop of refractive index oil, applied a cover slip, and switched the microscope to polarized light transmission mode. Arthur leaned over the monitor, suddenly deeply interested in the physical data. What do we have? I focused the lens on the largest particulate sample, which measured roughly 40 microns across. Under polarized light, the crystal structure of the dust particle glowed with vibrant, characteristic colors. That isn't standard indoor office dust, I observed, adjusting the fine focus. Indoor dust in this building consists primarily of textile fibers, skin squams, paper cellulose fragments, and atmospheric calcium carbonate from our concrete walls. What is it, then? Arthur asked. It's quartz silica, I said, examining the sharp, angular crystalline edges of the particle. Unweathered, highly angular quartz silica mixed with fine traces of iron oxide and coal soot. Coal soot? Arthur repeated, eyebrow raised. We converted the building's heating system from coal to oil in 1958, and then to natural gas in 1984. The old coal cellars under the original 1888 foundation were drained, sealed, and backfilled with gravel over 50 years ago. I moved the slide to examine a second particulate sample. It was a fragment of mineralized biological material, a tiny, fossilized spore of a bracket fungus commonly found in damp, subterranean masonry structures that lack forced air ventilation. This particulate matter didn't come from sublevel 2, I said with absolute conviction. Sublevel 2 has a continuous, triple-filtered HVAC system that maintains a particle count near zero. The air down there is practically clinical. This dust comes from an unventilated, damp masonry environment with active coal ash residue. The old 1888 foundation, Arthur whispered quietly, the logical connection forming instantly in his mind. The original basement level that predated the vault construction. According to the 1972 modernization plans, the 1888 coal cellars were entirely backfilled and capped with a 4-inch concrete slab when sublevel 1 and sublevel 2 were excavated, I recalled, my mind racing through the architectural history. There should be no open spaces remaining down there. Plans are drawn by men, Julian, Arthur pointed out softly. And men shortcut specifications when costs run over budget. If a section of the old 1888 foundation wall was simply walled off with a cinder block partition rather than backfilled, it would sit directly adjacent to the western wall of sublevel 2. A sudden realization struck me with cold, analytical clarity. I pulled up the digitized architectural plan of sublevel 2 on my computer monitor, overlaying it with the faded 1888 foundation diagram I had retrieved from the regional historical records 2 years prior. I zoomed in on the western perimeter wall of Base C. In the 1972 plans, the western wall of Base C was depicted as a continuous, solid 2-foot poured concrete barrier. But when I overlaid the 1888 diagram, I saw that the western wall of Base C ran precisely parallel to the old external coal chute of the original building, a heavy stone archway where horse-drawn carts used to dump coal directly into the subterranean storage cellars. I looked down at the physical mahogany box sitting on the table. Then I recalled the third line of the invisible cursive text we had uncovered under the ultraviolet lamp yesterday. 42 paces from the western pier. I grabbed a metal tape measure, my notebook, and a high-powered LED flashlight from the supply cabinet. "Arthur," I said, turning toward the door. "Come with me down to Base C." "What are we looking for?" Arthur asked, grabbing his own coat. "We are going to measure the western wall," I said firmly. "We are going to verify whether 2 feet of poured concrete actually exists behind Shelf 3, or if we have been trusting a 50-year-old drawing that lied to us." We descended the stairs to sublevel 2. The concrete corridor was quiet, cold, and bright under the stark LED tube lights. The air felt sterile, devoid of draft or moisture. We unlocked the heavy steel door of sublevel 2, entered the main hallway, and proceeded directly into Base C. The motion sensor clicked overhead, flooding the metal shelving bays with sharp white light. I walked to aisle 4, cranked the mechanical handle on the face of the steel frame, and opened the aisle where I had discovered the box 4 hours earlier. Shelf 3 sat empty where the mahogany box had been. On either side stood the gray acid-free document cases, Box C416 and Box C417. I stepped into the narrow path, reached past the document cases, and shone my high-powered LED flashlight directly at the back panel of the shelving unit. The high-density shelving frames in Base C were mounted directly against the western structural wall of the room. The steel uprights were bolted to the concrete floor, but the back of the shelf frame was separated from the perimeter wall by a narrow 6-inch gap to allow air circulation and prevent moisture buildup against the storage cases. I knelt on the cold floor, angled my flashlight into the 6-inch gap behind Shelf 3, and pressed my face against the steel upright to look behind the frame. The light illuminated the surface of the western wall. It was not smooth, gray, poured concrete. Directly behind Box C416 and C417, hidden completely from view by the heavy steel shelving unit, was a vertical section of wall constructed of rough, dark red Victorian brickwork and crumbling lime mortar, the unmistakable masonry of the original 1888 foundation. The 1972 concrete wall had not been poured continuously. The contractors had built around a surviving section of the 19th century structure, capping it with a thin plaster facade that had, over decades, cracked, dried, and deteriorated under the constant mechanical vibration of the sliding shelving tracks. I focused the intense beam of my flashlight on the center of the exposed brickwork, directly level with Shelf 3. There was a clean, horizontal fissure in the lime mortar, a seam 4 inches high and 8 inches wide, where 2 courses of brick had been removed or had collapsed inward into an unlit void beyond the wall. Sitting on the bottom edge of the brick opening, half embedded in dark, coal-dusted lime mortar, was a second wooden object, identical in finish and joinery to the first. I stood up slowly, my heart beating with a measured, disciplined rhythm. The impossibility had dissolved. The physical mechanics were now clear. The mahogany box had not materialized through solid matter, nor had it been carried through the locked steel door of sublevel 2 by an invisible intruder. It had been resting inside a forgotten, unmapped hollow within the 1888 brickwork for decades. The mechanical vibration of the heavy sliding shelving tracks when I had vigorously cranked the bays open this morning at 10:15 had finally dislodged the crumbling lime mortar around the opening, causing the first box to slide forward out of the wall fissure and drop 4 inches onto the steel shelf directly behind box C416. The mystery of its appearance was solved. It was a purely mechanical, physical event caused by structural decay and vibration. Yet, as Arthur and I stared into the dark opening behind the steel shelf, a far larger and more profound question immediately presented itself. If this hollow inside the 19th century foundation wall had remained sealed and forgotten behind a steel shelving rack for over 50 years, what else was sitting inside the darkness beyond that broken brickwork? When a physical impossibility resolves into a simple mechanical failure, the initial feeling is not relief, but a quiet, sharp restructuring of the problem. The illusion of a supernatural event dissolves under the reality of crumbling mortar, structural shortcuts, and the vibration of heavy steel tracks. Yet, in professional conservation work, solving the mechanism of an anomaly only uncovers the real issue sitting behind it. The mahogany box had not materialized through solid concrete, it had fallen out of an unmapped void within an 1888 brick foundation wall that 50-year-old architectural drawings claimed did not exist. The mystery of the box's arrival was solved, but the mystery of the void itself and the second wooden object glinting in the beam of my LED flashlight had just begun. I did not reach into the 6-inch gap behind the shelving rack to pull the second object out with my bare hands. Professional discipline prohibits impulsive action when encountering an uncatalogued, structurally unstable environment. Moving recklessly inside a confined space adjacent to load-bearing 19th century masonry risks dislodging further material, destroying fragile physical evidence, or causing a localized collapse of the brick course. I stood up in the narrow aisle of Bay C, turned to Arthur, and spoke in a low, measured voice. We do not touch it yet. We need a borescope camera, a physical stabilization kit, and a full structural survey of this perimeter wall before we proceed. Arthur looked at me, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, his gaze shifting between the dark gap behind shelf 3 and the high-powered flashlight in my hand. Julian, he whispered, stepping closer so his voice wouldn't echo in the concrete corridor. If that brickwork belongs to the old 1888 coal chute structure, it sits directly underneath the external stone terrace on the western side of the building. That area hasn't been accessed or ventilated in over 5 decades. Which explains the quartz silica and coal soot residue on the microscopic seam samples, I replied, adjusting the strap of my notebook. The void beyond that broken mortar line is part of the original subterranean foundation network. When the contractors excavated sublevel 2 in 1972, they didn't backfill the coal cellar as specified in the permit. They simply erected a false plaster facade over the exposed brickwork, bolted the mobile shelving tracks to the concrete slab, and covered up the discrepancy. We locked Bay C, exited vault sublevel 2, and returned to the main administrative office on the ground floor. My immediate responsibility was to establish a formal protocol. I filed a structural anomaly report with Miller, specifying that a void had opened behind the western shelving frame due to deteriorating historical mortar, and requested an immediate halt to all mechanical shelf operations in Bay C to prevent further vibration. Miller took the report, reviewed my hand-drawn diagram of the wall cavity, and scratched his jaw thoughtfully. I can lock out the electrical drive motors on the Bay C tracks, Julian, he said, pulling a red lockout tag from his bench. That will keep anyone from cranking those racks back and forth. But if you want to inspect what's behind that brickwork without tearing down 3 tons of high-density steel shelving, you're going to need a flexible optical probe. I intend to use the Conservation Lab's industrial fiber optic endoscope, I told him. We will record a continuous digital video feed of the cavity before we attempt to extract the second object or stabilize the masonry. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, the news of the structural discrepancy had reached the director. Howard summoned Arthur and me to his 3rd-floor office. The afternoon light filtered through the tall, leaded glass windows, casting long, geometric shadows across his wide mahogany desk. Howard looked visibly stressed, his hands resting flat on an open ledger sheet. Julian, Howard began, leaning forward and crossing his arms. Miller tells me we have a hollow section behind the vault shelving in Bay C. Are you entirely certain this is an 1888 structural artifact and not simply a settling crack in the modern foundation slab? It is an unmapped masonry cavity, Howard, I stated clearly, placing a high-resolution photograph of the exposed red brickwork onto his desk. The construction is hand-pressed Victorian clay brick bound with lime mortar. It contains an uncatalogued wooden container identical in joinery and material to the one I recovered yesterday morning. The mechanical vibration of the shelving racks dislodged the lime mortar, causing the first container to drop onto shelf 3. The second container remains resting inside the brick seam. Howard stared at the photograph, his finger tracing the outline of the dark red bricks. If the Board of Trustees learns that the 1972 vault expansion failed to meet structural backfill specifications, we could be looking at a mandatory engineering audit of the entire subterranean foundation. That would freeze our operating permit and halt our digitalization grants for months. Which is precisely why we must handle this with absolute methodical rigor, I argued calmly. If we document the physical space, extract the artifacts using non-invasive conservation protocols, and stabilize the brick cavity internally with lime-based grouting, we resolve the preservation risk without compromising the facility's structural classification. Howard studied my face for a long moment, seeking any sign of sensationalism or panic. Finding none, he exhaled slowly and nodded. Very well. You and Arthur have 48 hours to complete your optical inspection and artifact recovery. Keep the door to sub-level 2 locked. No external contractors, no public statements, and no administrative interruptions until you give me a written report on what sits inside that wall. The agreement was settled. We were given total authority over the physical investigation, anchored entirely within the parameters of sound archival science. For the next 24 hours, however, the investigation entered a mandatory period of absolute silence and waiting. In conservation work, patience as a physical tool is crucial as a scalpel or a suction table. Mortar dust inside an undisturbed cavity takes hours to settle completely after a structural disturbance. Inserting an optical probe into an active dust cloud coats the fiber optic lens with fine particulate, rendering the video feed useless and risking contamination of fragile organic materials within the space. We locked sub-level 2, engaged the red lockout tags on the mechanical crank drives, and waited. That evening, I returned to my apartment at my usual time of 6:15. The rain had ceased, leaving the tree-lined streets damp, quiet, and reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. My apartment felt remarkably still. I sat at my small dining table, cooked a simple dinner of boiled potatoes and poached fish, and opened my leather-bound research journal. I spent time analyzing the 4 cryptic lines uncovered under ultraviolet light on the first box. The ledger remains incomplete where the stone was laid. Look to the foundation before the third ledger closes. 42 paces from the western pier. Do not disturb the dry joinery. Everything now aligned with structural precision. 42 paces from the western pier was the exact physical pacing along the lower subterranean corridor from the building's primary western stone pier to aisle 4 of Bay C. Look to the foundation before the third ledger closes was Edward's explicit directive guiding the conservator to examine the foundation wall prior to finalizing the cataloging of Ledger 3, Central District titles. Do not disturb the dry joinery was a direct preservation warning regarding the delicate hand-cut dovetail interlocking seams of the mahogany boxes. I carefully plotted the spatial coordinates of the western perimeter wall on graph paper. I calculated the precise volume of the void based on the outer dimensions of the 1888 coal chute drawings. The original external coal archway measured 4 feet in width, 6 feet in height, and extended 6 feet inward from the outer foundation wall toward the central basement storage rooms. When the 1972 concrete vault was poured, it had truncated this coal archway, intersecting its eastern edge. If the contractors had merely walled over the gap rather than filling it with mass concrete, the remaining void was an enclosed, masonry-lined chamber measuring roughly 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 6 feet high, completely suspended between the outer stone foundation of the building and the inner concrete wall of sub-level 2. A sealed, unventilated brick chamber of those dimensions, protected from direct rainwater infiltration and maintained at the stable temperature of deep bedrock, constituted a near-perfect natural archival environment. Organic materials, wood, paper, leather, and iron could survive inside such a space for over a century with minimal chemical degradation, provided the relative humidity remained below 55%. The thought was intellectually exhilarating, yet I maintained my discipline. I closed my journal at precisely 10 o'clock, turned off the lights, and slept deeply. On Thursday morning, I arrived at the facility at 7:15. The air inside the main hallway was cool and quiet. Arthur was already in the conservation lab, calibrating the fiber optic endoscope, a flexible, 6-foot rubber cable equipped with a high-definition digital camera sensor, an adjustable LED ring light at the tip, and a portable monitor unit. "The sensor calibration is complete, Julian," Arthur said, adjusting the brightness control on the monitor screen. "The focal depth is set from 2 mm to infinity. We can resolve physical details down to 50 microns at close range." We gathered our equipment, the endoscope, a portable battery pack, sterile cotton collection swabs, a high-magnification handheld digital microscope, a set of brass non-magnetic spatulas, and a padded acid-free transport case lined with polyethylene foam. We descended the stone staircase to vault sub-level 2. The concrete corridor was silent. The red lockout tags hung motionless on the electrical control boxes of Base C. We unlocked the main steel door, entered the vault, and walked down to aisle 4. I stepped into the 3-foot path between the steel shelving units, placed the portable endoscope monitor on the work trolley behind me, and knelt on the cold concrete floor. The air behind shelf 3 smelled dry, flat, and distinctly earthy, the persistent scent of old brick, pulverized limestone, and coal dust. I turned on the endoscope's LED ring light. A sharp beam of white light shot from the tip of the flexible black cable. I carefully threaded the camera cable through the 6-inch gap between the back of the steel shelf upright and the crumbling brick wall, guiding the tip toward the 4-inch horizontal fissure in the lime mortar. On the portable monitor screen behind me, the magnified image of the wall sprang into clear focus. The camera tip passed through the outer layer of gray 19th-century plaster, which had cracked and flaked away like dried bark. The lens moved slowly into the horizontal gap where 2 courses of red clay brick had collapsed inward. "Steady, Julian," Arthur whispered, leaning over the monitor, watching the live video feed. "You're approaching the inner edge of the brick course." On the screen, the rough, pitted surface of the red brick gave way to an open dark void. I adjusted the LED intensity knob on the control handle, increasing the light output. The camera lens emerged into a broad, enclosed space. The video feed revealed a narrow, stone-lined chamber. The ceiling of the space was formed by a low, sturdy masonry arch constructed of dark granite blocks, the upper curve of the original 1888 coal chute. The stone walls were coated in a fine, velvety layer of black coal dust and dry, white efflorescence, mineral salt deposits left behind by moisture that had evaporated decades ago. Resting on the flat stone floor of the chamber, directly beneath the apex of the granite arch, was not merely a collection of loose items, but a carefully organized, deliberate physical structure. In the center of the stone floor stood a low, rectangular wooden chest made of thick, iron-bound oak, measuring approximately 2 feet in length and 18 inches in width. The heavy iron straps binding the corners were dark with old oxidation, but structural integrity appeared entirely intact. Surrounding the central oak chest, arranged in neat, precise concentric rows on the dry stone slab, were 8 small mahogany boxes identical in size, wood grain, dovetail joinery, and flush brass symbols to the single box I had discovered on shelf 3. The second box, the one I had spotted through the brick fissure yesterday, was resting near the edge of the brick seam, where it had tipped slightly forward when the surrounding mortar gave way. Arthur let out a quiet, sharp breath behind me. "It's a deliberate deposition, Julian. Look at the alignment. Those boxes weren't thrown down a chute or abandoned as garbage. They were placed there in a geometric pattern surrounding that central chest." I held the endoscope cable completely still, micro-adjusting the steering dial on the handle to pan the camera lens across the surface of the central oak chest. The top lid of the large oak chest was flat, fitted with a heavy wrought iron latch secured by a thick, antique brass lever padlock. Inlaid into the center of the oak lid, surrounded by 4 small copper rivets, was a large, polished brass plate. I advanced the camera tip closer, bringing the optical lens within 3 inches of the metal plate, and adjusted the digital focus. The ring light illuminated the deeply engraved inscription on the brass plate. The lettering was cut in a crisp, copperplate style, completely free of dust or tarnish. "Property of the Historical Survey and Title Repository. Deposited October 14, 1891. To be open only upon the destruction or alteration of the western pier." I stared at the glowing monitor screen, my mind processing the precise historical date written on the brass plate. October 14, 1891. Precisely 135 years ago. The Historical Survey and Title Repository, Arthur read aloud off the screen, his voice trembling slightly with professional awe. Julian, that was the private governing board that oversaw the acquisition and management of the waterfront properties before the regional rail network expansion in 1892. And the Western Pier, I added quietly, connecting the phrase to the invisible text we had discovered on the first mahogany box under ultraviolet light. It doesn't refer to a bridge in Bay Sea. It refers to the original stone Western Pier of the 1888 railway terminal, the exact structural pier upon which the western wall of this building was erected. Which means, Arthur said, turning to look down at me as I knelt on the floor, this entire collection was built directly into the foundation wall when the building was first erected, designed to remain completely undisturbed until the western wall itself was altered or damaged. I carefully retracted the endoscope cable an inch, panning the camera back across the 8 smaller mahogany boxes arranged around the central chest. Now that the camera had a wider field of view inside the chamber, I noticed a detail that had previously escaped my attention. Each of the small mahogany boxes had a tiny, handwritten paper tag attached to its flush side with a drop of red sealing wax. I guided the camera tip toward the box closest to the brick seam, the second box that was sitting on the verge of falling through the wall fissure. The ring light illuminated the tiny, aged paper tag. Written in fine, black iron gall ink was a single catalog designation. Ledger No. 4, Western Boundary Tracks. I held my breath as I realized the profound implication of that small paper tag. Our facility had been searching for the lost 19th-century Western boundary tract ledgers for over 40 years. According to our institutional history, those land title ledgers, which established the legal ownership boundaries for the entire Western Industrial District, had been officially recorded as destroyed by fire during the Regional Records Department blaze of 1895. Their absence had created hundreds of unresolved land title disputes over the past century, leaving vast swaths of regional commercial property in legal ambiguity. They had never been burned in a fire. They had been systematically removed from the public record, sealed inside iron-bound oak and mahogany joinery, and built directly into the subterranean masonry foundation of this building 3 years before the regional blaze ever occurred. I carefully pulled the endoscope cable back out of the brick seam, turned off the power unit, and stood up in the narrow steel aisle. My hands were entirely steady, my mind sharp and clear. The mystery was no longer a question of how a box arrived on a modern shelf. It was now a question of immense historical, legal, and institutional importance. We were standing 6 inches away from the most significant missing regional archive in the area's history, preserved intact inside a 19th-century stone vault. I turned to Arthur, whose face was pale with astonishment. "Arthur," I said calmly, setting the endoscope handle on the trolley. "Go upstairs and inform Howard that he needs to clear his schedule for the rest of the week." Arthur blinked, swallowing hard. "What are you going to do?" I picked up the padded transport case and a pair of long, non-magnetic brass extraction forceps. "I am going to safely retrieve the second mahogany box from the mortar seam before it falls. And then we are going to determine why someone went to such extraordinary lengths to hide the legal boundaries of this city inside a wall." I stepped back to the shelving rack, angled my flashlight into the gap, and prepared to make the first physical extraction. But as the beam of light struck the second mahogany box resting on the edge of the crumbling mortar, I noticed something new. A thin, dark leather strap was wrapped tightly around the middle of the second box, and tied to the end of that leather strap was a heavy, rusted iron key. Where did that key belong, and what was it meant to unlock before the wall was opened? Every physical clue carries a double purpose. It resolves an immediate practical uncertainty while simultaneously raising the stakes of the overall structure. The rusted iron key tied to the leather strap around the second mahogany box was not a random addition. It sat at the exact junction between the brick cavity and the modern vault aisle, resting precariously on the crumbling lime mortar. I did not pull the strap immediately. Using long, padded brass extraction forceps, I secured the body of the second box first, sliding it backward off the brick seam and into the polyethylene-lined transport case. Only when the wooden container was safely resting on a flat surface did I carefully lift the rusted iron key. The key was 4 inches long, constructed of heavy, hand-forged wrought iron with a simple bit and a solid cylindrical shaft. Its surface was dark with dry, stable oxidation, but free of flaking rust. Attached to the leather strap alongside the key was a second, tiny brass tag, stamped with 3 distinct numbers, 1888W. I carried both the second box and the key up to the second-floor conservation laboratory. Arthur was already at the central island, having returned from informing Director Howard. Howard arrived less than 5 minutes later, his face pale, his hands tucked deep into his suit pockets as he stared at the artifacts resting on our blotting paper. "Julian," Howard said, his voice unusually low. "Arthur tells me there is an entire iron-bound chest inside the wall, surrounded by identical wooden boxes." "That is correct," I replied, placing the iron key under the stereo microscope to inspect the bit pattern. "And this key was tied directly to the second box. The serial stamp on the tag 1888W corresponds to the original construction ledger of the 1888 railway building. The Western Foundation Pier," Arthur added, leaning over the table. "Howard, if those boxes contain the lost 1891 Western Boundary Tract ledgers, we are looking at the original land title deeds for the entire western waterfront. The regional authorities have operated on duplicate, incomplete surveys since the 1895 records fire." Howard ran a hand through his silver hair, pacing slowly around the stainless steel island. "If those records were placed inside that foundation wall in 1891, 3 years before the regional records fire, it means their disappearance was not an accident. It was a deliberate, premeditated concealment." "Precisely," I said, adjusting the microscope's ring light. "Someone on the Regional Land Title Commission used the construction of this building to permanently sequester the primary land titles. They created a false record of destruction in 1895 to ensure no one would search for the originals." I turned my attention to the second mahogany box. Unlike the first box, which had opened slightly due to the vibration of the shelving tracks, the second box remained tightly sealed. However, around its perimeter was a fine seam of dried red sealing wax that had cracked when the box shifted in the mortar gap. Using a fine ivory spatula, I gently flaked away the dead wax along the joint. The lid, joined by the same exquisite dovetail construction, slid back smoothly. Inside the dark mahogany casing rested a single, heavy volume bound in dark calfskin leather. The spine was stamped in gold leaf, Western Boundary Tracts, Ledger 4. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile inspection gloves and lifted the volume from the box. The pages were made of heavy, 100% rag paper, perfectly preserved by the low humidity, unventilated environment of the brick void. There was no mold, no foxing, and no ink gall decay. I opened the ledger to the first page. The manuscript was written in a copperplate hand using dark iron gall ink. The opening entry was dated September 12, 1891. It detailed the exact property boundaries, land grants, and industrial water rights for the Western Riverfront District. As I turned to the middle section of the ledger, a folded sheet of parchment slipped out from between pages 42 and 43. I unfolded the parchment carefully on a felt sheet. It was an original surveyor's map of the facility's foundation site, drawn in 1888 before the building was erected. In the lower left corner of the map, directly over the side of the Western Foundation Pier, was a red ink inscription written in the same disciplined cursive hand we had uncovered under the ultraviolet light on the first box. "The iron key opens the inner chamber within the Western Pier. The primary chest holds the original titles. The secondary boxes hold the unrecorded transfers. He who holds the key must verify the line before the stone is set." Arthur leaned over the map, pointing a finger at the red inscription. "Julian, look at the signature at the bottom of that parchment note." I brought a magnifying glass over the lower right corner of the sheet. Stamped in red wax alongside a formal flourish was a personal monogram, E.V. Chief Surveyor, Regional Land Title Commission, 1891. I froze, my hand holding the magnifying glass completely motionless above the parchment. "E.V." Arthur looked at me, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Julian. E.V. Is that?" "My great-grandfather," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the sudden, immense weight settling into the room. "Edward was the chief surveyor for the region in the late 19th century. My family knew he worked for the land office, but all his private papers were lost after his death in 1910. The logical connections, previously fragmented across architectural blueprints, security logs, and crumbling brickwork, instantly snapped into a single, cohesive framework. The placement of the boxes was not a random criminal concealment. It was an intentional, secret archive established by the chief surveyor himself, my own ancestor, built directly into the subterranean foundation of the building where his great-grandson would eventually work as senior conservator a century later. Howard stepped closer to the table, staring at the monogram on the parchment. "Julian, did you know about this before you found that box on Tuesday?" "No," I replied firmly, meeting his gaze directly. I had no knowledge of Edward's involvement with this building or these ledgers. My appointment to this facility 9 years ago was based entirely on my credentials in paper conservation. "Then it is an extraordinary coincidence," Howard muttered. "There are no coincidences in structural history, Howard," I corrected calmly. "My great-grandfather designed the vault storage system for this building in 1888. He ensured the coal chute void remained accessible from within the interior brickwork. He knew that any qualified archivist maintaining these shelves would eventually dislodge the mortar during routine cataloging." I picked up the 4-inch iron key marked 1888W. "The key tied to this second box doesn't open the small mahogany cases," I explained, looking from Howard to Arthur. "The small cases slide open once their wax seals are broken. This iron key is for the heavy brass lever padlock securing the main iron-bound oak chest inside the wall." Howard looked down at the key, then at the parchment map, and finally toward the hallway leading to the basement stairs. "If that main oak chest holds the unrecorded land transfers from 1891, Howard said, his voice tight with administrative realization, "it contains the original corporate land grants for every major commercial property along the Western District. Unsealing it will permanently alter the legal history of this region. Which is why we must open it systematically, under full protocol," I stated, setting the iron key into a padded velvet tray. I turned back to the manuscript map. As I examined the western pier diagram under the lab's focal light, I noticed a final detail marked in faint graphite pencil along the outer perimeter of the coal chute archway. It was a small, hand-drawn arrow pointing to the rear stone wall of the brick chamber behind the oak chest, accompanied by a single written label. 1891, Vault Section 2. Why was there a second section designated behind the primary oak chest, and what was stored in the deepest part of that stone wall that required a second verification before the chest could be unlocked? A discovery in an archive rarely moves in a straight path. As soon as a key piece of evidence drops into place, it shatters the previous boundaries of the inquiry. The realization that Edward, my own great-grandfather, had been the architect of this hidden repository transformed the nature of my work. This was no longer merely a structural anomaly or an institutional recovery project. It was a precise, calculated bequest left across 4 generations, anchored in the physical masonry of the building I had walked into every morning for nearly a decade. However, personal connection carries no weight against conservation protocol. The presence of my family monogram on the 1891 parchment did not alter the physical reality of the western perimeter wall. The brick cavity remained delicate, the lime mortar continued to crumble under mechanical stress, and the iron-bound oak chest sat beneath a century of settled coal dust, locked behind its antique brass lever padlock. By Friday morning, Director Howard had secured formal clearance from the Board of Trustees to execute a full, non-destructive extraction of the subterranean cavity. We locked Vault Sublevel 2 to all standard staff, posted security notices on the outer gates, and set up a clean extraction zone in Aisle 4 of Base C. Miller arrived at 8 o'clock carrying a portable masonry stabilizer, a low-pressure pump designed to inject a fluid, line-based consolidant into loose brick seams without generating heat or destructive expansion. "We'll consolidate the mortar along the top edge of the fissure first, Julian," Miller explained, his voice echoing softly against the concrete floor of Base C. "That will bind the loose clay bricks above the opening and prevent a localized drop while you reach into the chamber." I stood beside the work trolley, wearing a full protective Tyvek suit, nitro gloves, and a particulate respirator mask. Beside me, Arthur monitored the live feed from the fiber optic endoscope, which remained positioned inside the brick void to capture every millimeter of the operation. "Consolidant flow active," Miller reported, pressing the nozzle trigger. A fine, milky stream of lime binder flowed smoothly into the cracked mortar lines surrounding the fissure. Within 40 minutes, the liquid binder began to set, locking the loose Victorian brickwork into a rigid, stable arch. The access opening was now secure. The structural margin is stable, Julian, Miller said, stepping back and wiping his hands on a rag. You have a clear, reinforced portal. I stepped up to the 6-inch gap behind shelf 3. Using a long, articulated stainless steel mechanical arm equipped with soft rubber pads, I reached through the brick fissure toward the floor of the inner stone chamber. My first target was not the heavy oak chest, but the remaining 6 small mahogany boxes arranged in concentric rows around it. Systematically, one by one, the mechanical jaws clamped onto the dense mahogany sides, lifting them clear of the stone floor and drawing them back through the wall fissure. Arthur received each box at the edge of the shelf, inspected its red wax seal, logged its handwritten catalog tag, and placed it inside a climate-controlled transport container. Ledger No. Waterfront parcels. Ledger No. 2. Northern Rail rights. Ledger No. 3. Central District titles. Ledger No. Fee, River Basin grants. Ledger No. 6. Timber and mineral reservations. Ledger No. 7. Eastern Industrial Annexes. Every single missing volume of the 1891 Regional Land Survey was present, accounted for, and structurally undamaged. 40 years of institutional ambiguity, legal disputes, and missing boundary titles had been resolved in less than 2 hours of disciplined extraction. Finally, only the central iron-bound oak chest remained inside the chamber. It was far too large and heavy to pass through the 4-inch brick fissure. To retrieve it, we would need to carefully remove a 3-foot section of the false 1972 plaster facade and extract 2 courses of non-structural brickwork, a task scheduled for the following morning under Miller's supervision. However, the brass lever padlock securing the chest's iron latch was fully accessible through the portal. Before unlocking the main chest, I recalled the graphite inscription marked on the 1888 Foundation map, 1891, Fault Section 2, pointing directly behind the chest. I extended the fiber optic endoscope probe deeper into the stone void, passing the cable over the top lid of the oak chest to inspect the rear masonry wall. The ring light illuminated a small, rectangular recessed niche in the rear granite wall, a secondary zinc-lined compartment designated as Fault Section 2. Resting inside this protected niche was a heavy, sealed bronze cylinder with a screw-top lid stamped with the E.V. family seal. Using a specialized magnetic retriever tool, I pulled the bronze cylinder clear of Fault Section 2 and brought it back through the portal. Inside the bronze cylinder was the secondary verification required before unsealing the primary titles, the original 1891 Foundation Alignment Ledger and Structural Load Certificate, personally signed and sworn by Edward. It proved that the structural integrity of the Western Foundation pier was completely sound and uncompromised, fulfilling the precise legal condition that the physical foundation was certified before the master survey sheets could be brought forth. With Fault Section 2 fully documented and verified, I picked up the 4-inch iron key marked 1888W from its padded velvet tray. I attached the key to the tip of a specialized key-holding tool, extending it through the brick fissure into the darkened void. Arthur adjusted the endoscope ring light, focusing the camera lens directly on the antique lock cylinder. On the portable monitor screen, the heavy brass face of the padlock filled the display. I guided the iron key forward. The bit aligned with the keyway. With a soft, metallic slide, the key seated fully into the cylinder. I applied gentle, clockwise torque to the handle of the extension tool. For a second, the century-old iron resistance held firm against the mechanical leverage. Then, with a clean, sharp click that resonated clearly through the concrete aisle, the internal brass tumbler released. The heavy iron shackle sprang open. Lock disengaged, I reported quietly. Arthur cheered softly under his breath, leaning closer to the monitor. The latch is clear, Julian. Using the mechanical arm, I tipped the iron latch upward and gently pushed the flat oak lid of the chest open. The hinges groaned on their iron pins, swinging back to reveal the internal compartment. I guided the endoscope camera down into the open chest. The interior was lined with thick, zinc-coated sheet metal designed to repel moisture. Sitting neatly inside the zinc lining were not paper ledgers or leather-bound manuscripts, but 3 large, rolled sheets of heavy drafting linen, tied with faded blue silk ribbons. Beside the linen rolls rested a small, leather-bound personal diary, its cover stamped with the same red wax monogram I had seen on the surveyor's map, E.V. I maneuvered the mechanical arm into the chest, clamped the rubber pads around the silk-bound diary, and carefully pulled it out through the brick fissure. I held my great-grandfather's personal journal in my gloved hands. I carried it up to the conservation laboratory, accompanied by Arthur and Howard. We placed the volume on the central suction table under the shadowless daylight lamps. The leather cover was dry but supple. I turned to the final entry, dated October 13, 1891, the day before the repository was sealed behind the Western Foundation pier. The handwriting was the same sharp, disciplined cursive hand I had first uncovered under the ultraviolet light on the mahogany box 6 days prior. October 13, 1891. The primary land titles are secured within the stone chute of the Western Pier. The Commission believes the documents were destroyed in the storage vault transfer, and I shall not correct their assumption. The corporate cartel seeking to invalidate the public riverfront grants will find no paper trail to burn. I have placed the master survey maps and the true boundary deeds where no speculative buyer can reach them, built into the very stone foundation of the public rail terminal. Should the day come when the western wall is breached or altered, let my successor in this work take up the iron key, verify the lines on the drafting linen, and restore the public trust. The stone stands firm. The record remains complete. Edward V. Director Howard stood by the table, reading the words over my shoulder in absolute silence. The historical reality was stark, irrefutable, and completely free of intrigue or malice. It was a single, brave act of civic preservation carried out by a master surveyor who chose to hide his community's legal truth inside its physical foundation rather than allow it to be destroyed by private greed. I looked down at the dark mahogany boxes sitting in their neat row across our conservation island. The small wooden box that had dropped onto shelf 3 on Tuesday morning had not been placed there by an intruder, nor had it appeared by an impossible miracle. It had been held in place for 135 years by a course of Victorian lime mortar, waiting for the inevitable day when the mechanical vibration of a modern facility would finally shake the wall loose. Every anomaly had been explained. Every physical step had been traced back to its origin. Every piece of the equation had balanced to the millimeter. I looked at Arthur, then at Howard, and finally out the high laboratory windows toward the quiet, tree-lined street below. "The survey is complete," I said softly, closing the diary. "Everything fits together now." The recovery of the 8 Western Boundary Tract ledgers, the bronze cylinder from Vault Section 2, and Edward's personal diary provided the legal and historical framework of the concealment, but the physical work inside Vault Sublevel 2 was far from finished. The central iron-bound oak chest still rested within the stone coal chute, its sink-lined compartment holding the 3 heavy, silk-bound rolls of drafting linen. By Saturday morning, the atmosphere in the repository had shifted from tense investigation to controlled, systematic archive recovery. Under Miller's precise engineering direction, the non-structural plaster facade facing aisle 4 of Bay C was cleanly sectioned and removed. 2 courses of Victorian red clay brick were carefully unseated, expanding the 4-inch fissure into a neat, 3-foot structural portal. For the first time in 135 years, full ambient light spilled into the stone-lined coal chute. Arthur and I stepped through the expanded opening into the narrow chamber. The air was cool, dry, and heavy with the scent of aged cedar and faint coal ash. Working together, we lifted the iron-bound oak chest from its stone slab, carrying it through the portal and onto a heavy-duty hydraulic transport cart lined with shock-absorbing foam. We brought the chest directly to the main conservation lab on the 2nd floor, placing it on the central suction table alongside the 8 small mahogany boxes. Director Howard was waiting, his camera prepared to record the unrolling of the drafting linen for the Board of Trustees and the regional archivist who had been quietly notified earlier that morning. I pulled on a fresh pair of soft cotton gloves and untied the faded blue silk ribbon from the first drafting roll. The linen was thick, high-grade architectural vellum, preserved in near-immaculate condition by the internal zinc lining of the oak chest. Using gentle brass weights to hold the edges, Arthur and I slowly unrolled the first sheet across the suction table. The document was a hand-drawn, master survey map of the area's western riverfront district, executed in brilliant indigo ink with red property boundary lines. Every pier, rail track, warehouse lot, and public water right was rendered with extraordinary drafting precision. In the lower margin, stamped in dark red ink, was the official seal of the Regional Land Title Commission, alongside Edward's clean signature. Look at the water frontage, Julian, Arthur pointed out, his finger hovering an inch above the river boundary. According to the official records published after the 1895 fire, those 3 miles of riverfront were listed as private commercial grants belonging to the industrial rail cartels. And here, I said, pointing to the original Indigo lines, my great-grandfather's survey clearly marks them as dedicated public land. The cartels didn't buy those riverfront parcels, they altered the secondary survey copies and allowed the primary ledgers to disappear in the fire so they could claim ownership without a public title deed. I untied and unrolled the second and third drafting sheets. The second sheet contained the complete, unredacted land transfers showing every property transaction conducted between 1880 and 1891, complete with original deed numbers matching the 8 calfskin ledgers we had extracted from the mahogany boxes. The third sheet, however, was not a geographical land map. It was an architectural elevation drawing, a detailed structural blueprint of the very building we were standing in. Howard leaned over the table, examining the black ink lines of the stone edifice, the subterranean arches, and the deep foundation piers. He drew the repository himself, Howard whispered, reading the legend in the corner. Edward didn't just hide the records in a convenient building, he designed the building specifically to house the hidden repository. Look at the western perimeter wall on the blueprint, I noted, tracing the white line of the coal-chute archway. He engineered the brickwork with a double-faced hollow cavity directly behind shelf 3 of base C. He calculated the structural load so that the weight of the stone terrace above rested entirely on the granite arch, leaving the brick wall behind the shelving unit free of vertical pressure. Edward had foreseen the exact evolution of the facility. He knew that as the area expanded, the building would eventually become a permanent historical repository. He knew that the subterranean space would be converted into high-density storage, and he had deliberately positioned the mortar seam where the mechanical vibration of future shelving tracks would slowly loosen the line binder over time. He had not left the discovery to chance. He had anchored it to the physical decay of the materials and the inevitable routine of professional conservation. The human motive behind the entire sequence was now fully visible. Edward was not a conspirator, nor was he a thief. He was a master surveyor who realized that the legal identity of his community was being systematically erased by powerful private interests. Unable to fight the corruption through political channels, he used his professional skill, his knowledge of architecture, and his access to construction materials to build a physical time capsule that no court order, fire, or political decree could destroy. He had trusted that the truth would remain safely suspended in stone and mortar until a future generation equipped with the proper tools, patience, and professional discipline brought it back into the light. Howard took a deep breath, looking around the brightly lit laboratory at the assembled ledgers, the iron-bound chest, the drafting rolls, and the personal diary resting on the felt sheet. "This changes everything for the Western District," Howard said softly. "The regional legal office will have to reinstate the public land grants. Dozens of commercial disputes that have stalled regional development for 50 years will be resolved by these sheets." "And the institution?" Arthur asked, looking at the director. "We will establish the E.V. Historical Collection," Howard replied, looking at me with profound professional respect. "It will be catalogued, digitized, and placed on permanent display in the primary reading room." I stood by the suction table, looking down at my great-grandfather's signature on the indigo blueprint. The small mahogany box that had slipped onto shelf 3 on Tuesday morning was no longer an intruder in our system. It was the first link in an unbroken chain of physical evidence that had fulfilled its century-old purpose to the exact millimeter. The truth had emerged completely. The purpose was clear, grounded entirely in human foresight, engineering, and civic duty. I looked at Arthur, who was already preparing fresh archival sleeves for the drafting linen. "Let's begin the digitization cataloging," I said, pulling my research journal toward me. "We have a century of public records to restore." Resolution in conservation work does not arrive with a dramatic climax, it settles over a space like the gradual clearing of dust after a long-buried door is opened. When every physical clue has been traced, every mechanical failure accounted for, and every document restored to its rightful context, the mind ceases to ask questions. Order is re-established, the ledger is closed, and reality returns to its predictable, comforting rhythm. By Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I had first discovered the dark mahogany box resting on shelf 3 of base C, Vault Sublevel 2 had been entirely restored to operational standard. Under Miller's supervision, the false plaster facade facing aisle 4 was rebuilt and sealed. The historic red clay brickwork behind the shelving tracks was stabilized with a permanent line-based grout, leaving a small, brass-framed access plate over the old coal chute opening as a matter of structural record. The high-density mobile shelving units were re-engaged, their electric drive motors running smoothly and quietly along the floor tracks once more. The physical artifacts themselves, the 8 small mahogany boxes, the iron-bound oak chest, the 4-inch iron key, the 3 silk-bound drafting linens, the bronze structural cylinder from Vault Section 2, and Edward's calfskin diary had been safely transferred to the second-floor conservation laboratory. For 7 days, Arthur, Clara, and I worked systematically under shadowless daylight lamps, performing surface cleaning, flattened stabilization, and high-resolution digital scanning on every single page of the recovered 1891 Western Boundary Tract ledgers. There was no longer any ambiguity. The calfskin volumes contained the unblemished, original property deeds for the Western Riverfront District. The master drafting linen proved beyond a doubt that vast tracts of commercial land had been dedicated as permanent public property 3 years before the 1895 records fire was used to falsify the regional registry. On Tuesday afternoon, a formal delegation from the Regional Legal Office and the Historical Society arrived at the repository. Among them was the regional archivist, an elderly, sharp-eyed woman who spent nearly 2 hours inspecting the indigo ink lines of the drafting sheets under a magnifying glass. When she finally stood up, she looked at Director Howard, then at Arthur, and finally turned to me with a look of profound, quiet gratitude. "Mr. E. she said, her voice resonant in the quiet lab. "Your great-grandfather did not merely preserve paper. He preserved the legal integrity of this community at a time when no one else had the courage or the foresight to stand against private land speculation. These documents will resolve litigation that has stalled public waterfront development for over half a century." Howard signed the formal transfer docket on the workbench, officially entering the Edward V historical collection into the public record. Under the agreement, the original manuscripts and the iron-bound oak chest would remain permanently housed in our facility, secured inside a custom climate-controlled glass display case in the primary reading room. By 5 o'clock, the visitors had departed. The lab fell into its familiar, peaceful evening stillness. Rain tapped softly against the high, narrow windows, and the environmental monitors hummed their steady, 68-degree cadence. Arthur was at his station, carefully applying leather conditioner to the spine of a 19th-century atlas. He looked up at me over his wire-rimmed spectacles, a small, satisfied smile on his face. "A clean closure, Julian," Arthur remarked softly, setting his cloth down. "No missing pages, no unverified lines, and no loose ends." "A complete equation, Arthur," I replied, placing the final digitized ledger file into our permanent encrypted server drive. Every physical mark had a reason, and every reason had a physical mechanism. I picked up my coat, wrapped my scarf around my neck, and checked the lab one last time. The counters were clear, the tools were organized in their drawers, and the light switches were turned off one by one. I walked down the stone staircase to the main lobby, said goodnight to Miller at the security desk, and stepped out into the cool, damp evening air. The tree-lined street 4 blocks from my apartment was quiet. The streetlights reflected amber circles on the wet pavement, and the air smelled of autumn leaves and fresh rain. I walked my familiar, structured route at my usual steady pace, my mind entirely calm, unburdened by speculation or uncertainty. I thought about Edward standing in the subterranean coal chute of the railway building 135 years ago, carefully placing the mahogany boxes around the iron-bound chest, setting the lime mortar, and closing the brick wall. He had not trusted to chance, nor had he relied on miraculous intervention. He had trusted in the physical durability of good wood, the stability of deep stone foundations, and the disciplined routine of the archivists who would follow in his footsteps. He had known that order eventually asserts itself over disorder, and that truth, when anchored to physical reality, simply waits for someone to pay attention. I reached my building, climbed the stairs to my apartment, and unlocked the door. I hung my coat on the peg, placed my research journal on the desk, and poured a cup of hot tea. Sitting by the window, looking out over the quiet city lights, I felt a deep, reflective sense of completeness. The small mahogany box that had fallen onto shelf 3 of Bay C had not broken reality. It had restored it. Every piece of the puzzle had fit back into place with absolute precision, leaving nothing shadowed, nothing unexplained, and nothing lost to the dark.